8. German World War II plane wreck. In 2005, a team of mappers discovered a submerged plane wreck in a fjord off western Norway's Stavanger Peninsula. It was identified as a German-made World War II-era Heinkel HE-115 seaplane. It was raised in 2012 and is one of only 3 known surviving examples of the aircraft. The Norwegian Navy Air Services bought the plane in 1939 and used it as a torpedo bomber in the fight against the invading Nazis the following year. When Norway surrendered, the Germans commandeered the plane and used it to attack Allied merchant convoys along the Arctic route to the Soviet Union. It crashed into the fjord in 1942 and remained there for 70 years. No lives were lost in the accident. The recovered plane was towed to shore and removed from the water using a crane. It was surprisingly intact, considering its age and circumstances, owing to the fjord's minimal currents and the low oxygen silt that became buried in after it sank. As of 2012, the aircraft was in storage, awaiting restoration. 7. Minnewanka Landing. Situated near the eastern edge of Banff National Park in Alberta, Canada, Lake Minnewanka is a popular destination for kayakers, hikers, and other outdoor enthusiasts. Many of these visitors are unaware that the 13-mile-long lake isn't entirely a part of the natural landscape. It was once much smaller and was home to a resort village that now sits underwater. Known as Minnewanka Landing, it sat at the base of the Canadian Rockies. One of its first structures, built in 1886, was a log hotel called the Beach House. Over the years, the village grew to include more hotels, several restaurants, and dozens of cottages, which sat along 4 avenues and 3 streets. There were also numerous sailing companies that offered to take visitors on outings in the lake. A large portion of the town was submerged following the construction of a dam in 1912, but what was left of Minnewanka Landing continued to operate, and dozens of more cabins were built over the next 20 or so years. Its days came to an end when a bigger dam was built in 1941, causing the reservoir to rise 98 feet and swallow the village whole. Thanks to the lake's frigid waters, much of Minnewanka Landing is still intact, including building foundations, a chimney, sidewalks, a cellar, bridge pilings, and more. Visitors with scuba diving experience can catch a first-hand glimpse of this small piece of the area's history of human use, which dates back 13,000 years. 6. SS Pacific. Built in New York in 1850, the 223-foot-long wooden sidewheel steamer SS Pacific entered service at the height of the California Gold Rush. It carried several historically valuable loads of gold dust during its first years of service and during the Cassiar Gold Rush in British Columbia in the 1870s. During a routine voyage from Victoria, British Columbia to San Francisco in 1875, the Pacific collided with another ship, the Orpheus, off the Washington coast with 275 passengers and a rumored cargo of gold worth $7 million in today's currency. There's no way of knowing exactly what happened after the collision because only 2 people survived. But it is known that the Pacific had a rough voyage leading up to the crash, and the crew members had filled some of the lifeboats with water to correct a list. The other lifeboats proved inoperable, and the ship broke apart and sank within a half hour. Most of the passengers drowned or died from exposure or hypothermia. It's believed to be the deadliest disaster to ever happen off the Pacific Northwest coast. Many have attempted to find the gold-laden wreck, but it remained missing until late 2022, when a team led by a man named Jeff Hummel found a sunken vessel that's believed to be the Pacific. A court granted exclusive salvage rights to the team, who plan to carry out excavations between 2023 and 2025. Their findings will hopefully confirm the wreck's identity as the Pacific, and that it was carrying a large amount of gold. 5. A lost temple. Sometime during antiquity, possibly as far back as the 8th or 9th century BC, the Phoenicians built a spiritual sanctuary on the outskirts of what is now the Spanish port city of Cadiz. Known as the Temple of Hercules Gaditanos or the Temple of Melkart, it operated under 3 successive empires, ultimately falling under Roman rule. It was originally dedicated to the Phoenician god Melkart and later to the Roman god Hercules. At its peak, the temple was one of the Western world's most important religious sites. Historical accounts suggest that the Roman leaders Julius Caesar, Hannibal, and Scipio Africanus worshipped there. But its exact location has managed to elude experts, despite their exhaustive searches for what some have described as one of the holy grails of archaeology. A major lead came in early 2022, when researchers from the University of Seville identified a submerged structure in the Bay of Cadiz. Measuring 984 feet long and 492 feet wide, it sits in a shallow channel and is visible at low tide. The team identified the structure using a remote sensing method called light detection and ranging, or LiDAR, which makes buried and hidden objects and structures detectable. Further investigation will be required to confirm its identity, but its location, dimensions, and other identifiable details make it a good candidate for possibly being the Temple of Melkart. Some experts have criticized the findings and aren't convinced that the temple has been found. Studying the site will be challenging, but the team said that it plans to further investigate in hopes of being able to identify the structure. Do you think that this is the true Temple of Hercules Gaditanos? Tell us in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 4. HMS Endeavour. Better known as Captain Cook, James Cook was a British explorer, mapmaker, and naval officer who commanded 3 historic voyages during the late 18th century. Cook carried out his first voyage of discovery from 1768 to 1771 aboard a 100-foot-long research vessel called the HMS Endeavour. He became the second European to reach New Zealand and the first to make contact with Australia's eastern coast. The journey continued westward from there, passing through the Dutch East Indies in what is now Indonesia and rounding Africa's Cape of Good Hope before sailing back to England. After the nearly 3-year voyage ended, the Endeavour spent a few years transporting troops back and forth to the Falklands Islands before being sold into private hands as a timber ship. It was called back into service during the American Revolution and was scuttled off Rhode Island in 1778. Despite being one of naval history's most famous ships, the Endeavour's location has remained elusive for the past 250 years. A team of researchers and explorers found a wooden shipwreck in Newport Harbor that they believe may be the Endeavour in 2019 after decades of searching. In 2022, experts from the Australian National Maritime Museum announced that the wreck's identity had been confirmed. But the discovery's lead investigator, Kathy Abbas of the Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project, accused the Australians of jumping the gun with their conclusions. She also accused them of breaching a clause in the contract between the museum and her organization regarding the sharing of information with the public. Abbas said that there is no indisputable evidence to prove that the wreck is the Endeavour, especially since numerous other ships were sunk in the harbor during the same time period. The jury is officially still out while researchers look for clues that could identify the ship, but their time to do so may be limited. In addition to all the wear and tear you could expect a ship to go through from sitting underwater for centuries, it's being eaten by shipworms, which could dramatically speed up its decay. 3. A medieval shipwreck. During a project to map the 140 square mile lakebed of Norway's largest lake, Mjøsa, researchers located what appears to be a medieval shipwreck dating as far back as 700 years. They made the initial discovery using sonar technology and subsequently captured photos of the wreck using a remotely operated vehicle. Sitting at a depth of 1,350 feet, the 33-foot wreck is surprisingly intact. Its iron nails have started to rust, but are still holding the ship together for now, enabling the researchers to observe its overlapping structure. Based on its construction method, they believe it's a Norse vessel that was built during the Viking Age. The boat's location in the middle of the lake suggests that it sank during a storm. All things considered, the discovery isn't too surprising. Located roughly 60 miles north of Oslo, Lake Mjøsa was a busy trade route during the Viking Age. The team that discovered it wasn't looking for shipwrecks, but they expected to find some old artifacts. Because the lake was a popular dumping ground for surplus munitions between the 1940s and the 70s, their primary objective was to assess the possible health hazards of its contents to ensure the safety of the 100,000 people who rely on it for drinking water. Finding the ship was merely a bonus. Around 20 other wrecks have been found in the lake, but this is the first ship to be discovered at a depth beyond what's accessible to scuba divers. 2. World War II bomber. In 2017, a team of divers set out to find a World War II aircraft that crashed in the Aegean Sea near the Greek island of Ikaria in 1945. By then, they'd spent years trying to nail down the plane's location based on official records and eyewitness accounts from elderly villagers who remembered watching it plunge into the sea. The long missing aircraft, identified as an American-made twin-engine Martin Baltimore bomber, was found in 52 feet of water. Introduced in 1941, it was primarily used by the British Royal Air Force and other Allied militaries in the Mediterranean and North Africa. The plane that crashed off Ikaria was carrying 4 crew members of the Royal Hellenic Air Force during a training mission when one of its engines seized about an hour after takeoff. As it began to lose altitude, the pilot, A. Dimopoulos, decided to make an emergency landing at Ikaria, but he couldn't locate anywhere to land on the island, so he ditched the aircraft at sea. Radio operator Sotirios Varthis and airman Ioannis Zakharopoulos died in the wreck. Dimopoulos and the plane's navigator Vasilios Dematsis survived and were rescued by locals who rushed out into the water to help. The cause of the engine trouble that led to the crash remains a mystery to this day. Only 1,575 Martin Baltimores were ever made, and there are no surviving intact examples of the aircraft, earning it the nickname of the Forgotten Bomber. Out of the handful of wrecks that are known to exist, the plane that sank off Ikaria is quite possibly the best preserved, owing to its depth, which has kept it protected from large numbers of visitors. 1. The Iron Ton. Located off Michigan's northeastern coast, the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary is the final resting place of at least 200 ships that sank in Lake Huron's notoriously rough waters, earning it the nickname of Shipwreck Alley. While it's not uncommon to discover wrecks, one recent addition to the ever-growing list of ill-fated ships was particularly noteworthy. Discovered by researchers in 2019, the 191-foot vessel is in remarkably pristine condition. The team held off on announcing the discovery until early 2023, after they confirmed its identity as the Iron Ton, a cargo vessel that met a particularly tragic fate one night in 1894. The Iron Ton and another vessel, the Moonlight, were being towed by a steamer in clear conditions when the steamer's engine failed. When a strong wind began blowing the two ships toward the steamer, the Moonlight's crew cut the tow line to prevent a collision, separating them from the steamer. The Iron Ton began to drift as its captain and 6 crew members fought to regain control of it. Their efforts were in vain, and the wind blew the ship right into the oncoming path of a grain hauler called the Ohio, causing the vessels to collide head-on. All 16 of the Ohio's crew members made it onto lifeboats and were rescued, but the Iron Ton continued to drift and disappeared from sight. After drifting for an hour and realizing that the ship was going to sink, the captain ordered everyone onto its lifeboat. But they forgot to untie the line, securing it to the Iron Ton, and it was pulled underwater as the vessel plunged to its watery grave, taking 5 of the men with it. 2 crew members managed to surface and clung desperately to debris for the next several hours until a passing ship rescued them. The Iron Ton's discovery came 2 years after an expedition team located the Ohio at a depth of roughly 300 feet. They hoped that finding the Ohio would help lead them to the Iron Ton, but its location remained a mystery until the NOAA teamed up with world-renowned underwater mapping experts from the Ocean Exploration Trust. 10. Transair Flight 810. Shortly after taking off, the pilot of Transair Flight 810 reported mechanical trouble, with the complete loss of one engine and the second quickly starting to overheat. The crew knew they were in trouble. After contacting flight control and trying to return to the runway, the pilot realized they had to put the aircraft into the water. Only 11 minutes after takeoff, Transair 810 went into the water 3 miles south of the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The plane came to rest on a shelf between 350 and 450 feet underwater after the crew evacuated. In a joint effort between the NTSB, local authorities, and private contractors, an effort to recover the aircraft was launched. Over several months, both pieces of the fuselage were found, along with 2 JT-8D engines. All 8 cargo containers and the flight's onboard recorders were salvaged from the wreck. Recovering nearly the entire aircraft and the onboard recording devices is a massive step in helping the NTSB find out what exactly went wrong. 9. The rescue of Harrison Okene. In May 2013, Harrison Okene was a cook on a tugboat that sank in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Nigeria. He was one of 12 crew members, but he was the only survivor. Somehow, he managed to stay alive for 60 hours in a tiny air pocket inside the overturned vessel, about 30 meters underwater. Okene's troubles began when he woke up to use the bathroom and heard a loud noise. He realized water was rushing into the boat, so he scrambled to find an exit. The cook made his way to a cabin with a small pocket of air and waited for help. He had no water or food, only a bottle of soda. He also had no light except for his phone, which quickly died. He prayed and recited prayers as he heard sharks and fish eating his dead colleagues. Okene also heard rescue divers knocking on the hull, but they couldn't hear him. He was losing hope when he finally saw a light. It was a diver who expected to recover bodies, not any survivors. The diver was shocked to see Okene's hand reaching out. He quickly gave him an oxygen mask and a helmet while communicating with his team on the surface. They created a plan to bring Okene safely up, avoiding decompression sickness that could be fatal after spending such a long time underwater. When Okene was brought up to the surface, he was taken to a decompression chamber for 60 hours. Then he was reunited with his family and friends, who were overjoyed to see him alive. His story made headlines around the world as he beat the odds and lived. 8. The MV Tricolor. The Norwegian vehicle carrier MV Tricolor sank in the English Channel back in 2002 after colliding with another ship. It was carrying about 3,000 luxury cars worth roughly $50 million. The wreck posed a hazard to naval navigation and a threat to the overall environment, so a salvage operation was quickly launched to remove it. The team decided to cut the ship into 9 pieces using a wire saw before lifting them onto barges. The operation was complex, as it involved working in deep water with strong currents and bad weather. The cutting took 6 or so months, from April to October 2003. Lifting the pieces was delayed by several factors, including legal disputes, technical problems, and more. The last piece was finally recovered in July 2004, almost 2 years after the sinking. It was transported to Belgium for recycling. The salvage of the MV Tricolor cost about $40 million and was one of the most challenging maritime salvage operations ever undertaken. 7. Project Azorian. Project Azorian was a secret CIA operation with the purpose of recovering a sunken Soviet submarine, K-129, from the Pacific Ocean in 1974. The CIA used the Hughes Glomar Explorer, which was disguised as a deep-sea mining ship. The vessel had a giant claw that could lift objects from depths of 3 miles. The recovery was very risky, as the CIA had to avoid detection by Soviets and deal with technical difficulties. The submarine was also damaged by an explosion, causing it to sink in 1968. The agency managed to retrieve only part of the submarine. Some sources say they recovered 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, codebooks, and 6 bodies of Soviet sailors. The operation was kept secret for years until details were leaked to the press in 1975. The CIA tried to limit information about Project Azorian, using the phrase neither confirm nor deny, which became well known as the Glomar response. Project Azorian remains one of the most daring and impressive feats of espionage and engineering in modern history. 6. The Costa Concordia. The Costa Concordia was an Italian cruise ship that capsized on January 13, 2012, after running into the rocks in Italy's Tyrrhenian Sea. In total, 4,200 people were aboard the ship. The collision made a huge gash in the hull and flooded multiple compartments. The ship tilted to one side and eventually flipped. The rescue operation involved helicopters, boats, divers, and locals who helped evacuate survivors. It took over 6 hours to rescue most of the people on board, but some remained trapped inside for a day. The disaster killed 32 people and injured hundreds more. The salvage operation was one of the most expensive in maritime history. It involved stabilizing the ship, removing fuel and debris, refloating it, and towing it away. The process took more than 2 years and cost over $2 billion. The shipwreck had a lasting impact on the island of Giglio and its residents. The island soon became a tourist attraction for curious visitors who wanted to see the wreck site for themselves. Some locals benefited from the business, while others resented the intrusion and disruption. Do you think you could have survived if your cruise ship sank? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed the video so far. 5. Recovery of the USS Oklahoma. On August 13, 1941, the USS Oklahoma was moored alongside the USS Maryland BB-46 when Japanese aircraft launched a deadly attack. Its port side was torn open by Type 91 aerial torpedoes, causing it to roll onto its side with over 400 men trapped below deck. From the start of the assault, sailors and civilian Navy Yard employees launched a rescue effort. They cut away torn hull fittings, patched holes, and cleared debris away. Eventually, Oklahoma was brought back to the surface and was ready for repair. This process took months, and many crew members died during the effort to revive the ship. On Monday, the last 33 members of Oklahoma's crew were reinterred at Pearl Harbor, and their names were recorded on the cords of the missing at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. This is just one more step toward fulfilling a promise made to servicemen in World War II that their country would do everything in its power to get them home safely. 4. The recovery of Apollo 13. Apollo 13 was a lunar mission that faced a series of problems, preventing it from landing on the moon. The lives of 3 crew members were endangered: Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. On April 13, 1970, an oxygen tank exploded in the service module, causing a loss of power, heat, and oxygen. The crew had to use the module as a survival lifeboat and return to Earth. NASA personnel on the ground worked tirelessly to create solutions for challenges such as conserving power, fixing carbon dioxide levels, navigating, and making a safe re-entry. The crew also had to endure freezing temperatures, sleep deprivation, and unbelievable stress. On April 17, 1970, after 4 days, Apollo 13 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The crew was welcomed aboard the recovery ship USS Iwo Jima by Rear Admiral Donald C. Davis. A life-size sculpture capturing this moment was installed at the Houston Space Center in 2021. Apollo 13 was dubbed a successful failure because it demonstrated NASA's ability to overcome a treacherous crisis and bring the crew home safely. 3. The recovery of the Kursk. On August 12, 2000, the Kursk nuclear submarine plunged into the Barents Sea and submerged beneath water, leaving 118 crew members dead and 23 survivors trapped with little hope. On a routine exercise with Russia's aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov and battlecruiser Pyotr Veliky, the Kursk suffered 2 devastating explosions. Western and Russian officials are divided over what caused this accident. Russian military leaders say the submarine was hit by a spy submarine, though Western nations deny this claim. The Kursk sank within minutes after the blast, but 23 sailors survived and took shelter at the back of the vessel. Russia sent a rescue mini-sub to help, but its batteries were too low to sustain the operation for long. The Soviet government kept quiet about the incident and only accepted international help days after the sinking. After months, the rescue of the 118 crew members was completed. The Russian government now has to decide whether or not to raise the doomed submarine. This project has divided Russian military observers and will require significant financial investment. On top of that, bad weather could potentially interfere with operations. Ultimately, it will be towed to a dry dock near Roslyakovo for storage. 2. The recovery of the Ever Given. The Ever Given was a massive cargo ship that blocked the Suez Canal for about 6 days back in March 2021. The canal is a vital route for trade, connecting Europe and Asia. The blockage caused a backlog of ships and disrupted international supply chains. The accident happened on March 23, 2021, when strong winds and poor visibility forced the Ever Given to veer off course and run aground on the banks of the canal. The ship was 1,312 feet long and weighed roughly 200,000 tons, making it one of the largest vessels still in operation. It was carrying 18,300 containers of goods. A complex salvage operation was formed to free the ship, involving tugboats, dredgers, excavators, and more. They had to remove large areas of sand and mud from around the ship's bow and stern, while also using high tides to lift it up. On March 29th, after 6 days of intense efforts, the Ever Given was finally refloated and towed to a nearby lake for inspection. The accident's cause is still under investigation. Some factors that may have been to blame include human error, technical failure, weather conditions, and canal design. The Suez Canal Authority (SCA) sought compensation from the ship's owner for the cost of the salvage, damage to the canal's banks, and more. The ship remained impounded until July 7, 2021, when a settlement deal was reached between both parties. This incident highlighted the vulnerability of global supply chains and raised questions about both maritime safety and efficiency. 1. Recovery of the Deep Horizon oil well. Recovery from the Deep Horizon oil well is a difficult and expensive endeavor. It's required billions of dollars in cleanup costs, with many impacts yet to come. In April 2010, a well blew out in Texas, killing 11 people and spilling 134 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, one of the largest oil spills in history. It had devastating effects on communities along the East Coast, from Texas to Florida. Days after the explosion, British petroleum and environmental first responders worked to contain the spill by spraying dispersants that help break down oil, setting surface oil afire, and using floating booms in underwater chambers, which helped stop the leak from spreading further. But over time, the oil slick grew larger, coating 1,300 miles of shoreline, leaving thousands of people unemployed in the fishing, tourism, and energy industries. It was so severe that it threatened marine life like shrimp, lobster, and other shellfish by polluting their habitats. Scientists are still investigating the impacts of oil on these areas and other natural resources in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Scientists are currently evaluating potential solutions to understand what type of environmental restoration and conservation measures will be necessary to fully restore ecosystems and their services. It will take time for these damaged resources to recover, but with the correct environmental restoration, it's possible. Researchers are working closely with other agencies to identify which types of restoration are necessary in different affected regions and are assessing their costs and effectiveness. They'll then determine how much funding is needed and ensure it's allocated wisely and efficiently. 8. The Tulsamerican. On December 17, 1944, after being badly damaged in an air fight against the Germans over Poland, a B-24 Liberator bomber crashed into the Adriatic Sea near the Croatian island of Vis with 10 crew members aboard. 7 out of the 10 crewmen were pulled from the water alive by local fishermen and rescuers. The other 3 lost their lives in the wreck. 66 years later, in 2010, the aircraft was found broken in 2 on the seafloor. During a recovery mission in 2017, underwater archaeologists retrieved several artifacts from the wreckage, including military equipment, a life vest, and a flight boot. They also discovered human remains, which were later identified as belonging to the Liberator's pilot, Lieutenant Eugene Ford. After resting at the bottom of the sea for more than 70 years, his ashes were laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. The submerged aircraft, nicknamed the Tulsamerican, was the last B-24 to roll off the production line at the Douglas Aircraft Company in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The workers who built the ill-fated bomber painted their names on it, and locals even followed its travels throughout its wartime service. Also sometimes referred to as the Model 32, the American-built consolidated B-24 Liberator is the most produced heavy bomber and multi-engine aircraft in history. The plane saw extensive use throughout World War II, but was rendered obsolete in just a handful of years by newer bombers and went out of production by the end of the conflict. Over 18,000 were built between 1941 and 1945, yet just a handful survive today, along with a few dozen known wrecks that are in varying states of decay. 7. Whyda Galley. Captain Samuel Black Sam Bellamy was the wealthiest pirate there ever was, despite his short-lived career, which saw the capture of 53 ships in little over a year, with help from his trusty crew. He began working on ships as a teenager and was a skilled sailor by the time he began plundering ships in his mid-20s. In 1717, Bellamy pursued a slave ship called the Whyda Galley in the Caribbean Sea as it sailed between Cuba and Hispaniola, an island that's home to modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The Whyda Galley's captain surrendered after a 3-day chase, and Black Sam proceeded to turn it into his flagship vessel, fitting it with 10 cannons and assigning a crew to operate it. The band of pirates sailed up to the Carolinas and northward along the eastern seaboard of the US, with the goal of reaching Maine, looting and capturing more ships along the way. However, their mission was cut short just weeks after the Whyda Galley came into their possession, when the vessel ran aground in a violent storm off Cape Cod. Only 2 men survived, despite the ship wrecking just 500 feet from the coastline in 16 feet of water. Over 100 bodies washed ashore, and dozens more are believed to have gone down with the ship. An explorer named Barry Clifford discovered the treasure-laden wreck in 1984, 260 years after it sank. Since then, more than 200,000 artifacts have been recovered from the vessel, including the ship's bell, which is inscribed with its name, pistols, game pieces, and a hoard of silver coins. In 2021, archaeologists announced the discovery of 6 human skeletons. Black Sam died in the wreck, so it's entirely possible that some of the remains could belong to the infamous pirate himself. Experts have already obtained a DNA sample from one of Bellamy's living relatives. And, at the time of the discovery, they announced plans to try retrieving the skeletons from the wreck in hopes of performing a DNA analysis. 6. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. On October 13, 1972, 19 rugby players, along with their 21 family members and friends, boarded a plane in the Uruguayan capital of Montevideo for a game in Santiago, Chile. But there was an inexperienced co-pilot at the controls, and he mistakenly thought the plane was approaching its descent. As a result, he made a turn 40 miles early and struck a mountain in the eastern Andes. The aircraft's wings and tail were sheared off before the fuselage barreled down the slope at 220 miles per hour, coming to rest at an elevation of 11,710 feet. 12 people died immediately, and several more succumbed to their injuries in the harsh cold. The remaining 33 survivors struggled to stay warm in the fuselage while awaiting rescue. Authorities searched for 8 days and flew over the wreck several times, but failed to spot it against the snow. The search was called off on the 8th day, but by then the survivors had run out of food. They tried to eat leather and cotton from inside the plane's seats, but got sick from it. During a discussion beyond most people's nightmares, they all agreed that it was appropriate for the others to eat their body if they passed away. They were horrified by the thought, but ultimately they had no other choice. Over the next 72 days, at least 13 more people died from exposure, starvation, and an avalanche. In a last-ditch effort to escape death, 2 survivors trekked 38 miles until they found some herdsmen who summoned help. The remaining 14 survivors at the crash site were rescued over the following 2 days. authorities buried the bodies of the deceased at the site in a mass grave, marked with a small memorial plaque and a cross. Then, as if to erase the horrific tragedy from their memories, they burned the fuselage. 5. Antikythera wreck. Around 2,100 years ago during the Roman era, a Greek cargo ship wrecked off the island of Antikythera in the Aegean Sea. Since its discovery by sponge divers in the year 1900, a variety of artifacts have been recovered from the ancient vessel, including statues, coins, musical instruments, glass bowls, ceramic jars, jewelry, and other items, dating as far back as the 4th century BC. The wreck is most famously known for a curious device known as the Antikythera mechanism. Known as an orrery, it was used to predict eclipses and other astronomical phenomena decades in advance. It's such an exceptional machine that some consider it to be the world's oldest analog computer. Human remains were first discovered among the wreck in 1976. However, in the absence of DNA technology, they offered limited information to experts at the time. Then, in 2016, the skeleton of a young man was found buried beneath sand and pottery fragments at the site. Ancient DNA expert Hannes Schroeder came to the conclusion that the individual, nicknamed Pamphilos by the team who discovered him, died when he was in his late teens or early 20s. Researchers hoped to extract DNA from the ancient skeleton so they could learn more about one of the crew members who died aboard the ill-fated ship. But unfortunately, it's unclear whether they were successful. Who do you think designed the Antikythera mechanism? Let us know in the comments down below. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 4. Beautiful Betsy. As World War II entered its final months in early 1945, a B-24 Liberator bomber, nicknamed Beautiful Betsy, vanished while flying across Australia from Darwin to Brisbane. On board were 6 American servicemen and 2 British military members. The plane had been damaged in previous bombing missions. It was slated for retirement and was only being used for short missions due to its condition. Numerous search expeditions failed to find the missing aircraft, and Beautiful Betsy's fate remained a mystery until 49 years later in 1994, when a park ranger spotted the wreck while surveying wildfire damage in Crumbit Tops National Park. The blaze had cleared overgrowth, making the plane just visible enough for the ranger to see the exposed part of it glistening in the sun. A US Army recovery team flew in from Hawaii and collected human remains from the wreck, which had failed to turn up during an initial search by Australian authorities. Oddly enough, it's unclear whether the remains were ever identified or properly put to rest. Other items found on the site included dog tags, jewelry, a flare gun, a whistle, a cigarette lighter, a razor, a pocket watch, and a 1938 class ring. The wreck's location was initially kept hidden from the public to dissuade souvenir hunters, but it's since been opened to the public. 3. HMS Victory. Throughout naval history, there's been at least 6 ships named the HMS Victory. One of them was built for the British Royal Navy during the 1730s using timbers from the previous Victory, which caught fire and was destroyed in 1721. Armed with 110 guns, the newly built 174-foot-long vessel was the world's biggest and most powerful ship at the time of its completion. It served as the flagship of a highly respected British commander named Admiral Sir John Bouchan. Bouchan's fleet encountered a formidable storm in the English Channel on October 3, 1744, while on its way back to England after helping to pierce a French blockade off Portugal. As a result, the fleet became scattered, and the Victory vanished beneath the waves. Its mast was found washed up on the Channel island of Guernsey, but a large search failed to turn up any other sign of the ship. The Victory's 1,150 sailors were seemingly lost, and so too was the large amount of gold it was rumored to be carrying when it sank. It was long believed that the Victory crashed into a group of rocks called the Casquet in the Channel Islands. But its discovery in 2008, 260 years after it sank, proved that this estimation was off by about 50 miles. In the end, the wreck was found roughly 330 feet underwater at the bottom of a busy shipping lane by the recovery group Odyssey Marine Exploration. Included among the expedition's initial findings were several extremely rare bronze cannons bearing the crest of King George I, which helped identify the ship. The team raised a 42-pound 90-kilogram and a 12-pound 5-kilogram cannon, which are now on display at the Portsmouth Historic Dockyard. In 2010, marine archaeologists found human remains aboard the sunken ship. It's unclear whether the bones were recovered for further study, but at the time of their discovery it was mentioned as a possibility. Because the Victory is classified as a military wreck, it's legally considered the property of the British government. It's not known whether any of the fabled treasure it was said to be carrying was ever found, or if there are any future plans to excavate the wreck or raise it from its watery grave. 2. Long missing military transport plane. A US Air Force cargo plane vanished in 1952 while flying from Washington State to Anchorage with 52 people aboard. Less than a week later, it was found wrecked on Mount Gennett in eastern Alaska. The aircraft was so mangled it was barely recognizable, and it had become encased in snow after the crash triggered an avalanche. There was no way anyone survived. Air Force officials ruled that the accident resulted from a navigational error that was caused by bad weather and poor instruments. Within a year of the wreck, the plane had become buried in 50 feet of snow. Glacial movement further obscured its location, and it became lost until 2012, when an Army National Guard pilot noticed debris while flying a helicopter overhead. Officials initially assumed that it was a recent crash that hadn't been reported yet, but a ground search revealed the aircraft's true identity and age. In the 60 years since the crash, the plane had traveled 13 miles from the original site. During the 1 month of the year that it's safe to go to the site, a volunteer military crew recovered what they could. They found uniforms, dog tags, wedding rings, wallets, and other personal effects, as well as the remains of 37 victims who perished in the disaster. 1. HMS Pandora. Launched in 1779, the British Royal Navy ship HMS Pandora was responsible for the capture of numerous merchant vessels during the American Revolution. However, it's most famous for hunting down and capturing 14 of the 23 mutineers who'd seized control of another Royal Navy vessel, the HMS Bounty, in the South Pacific in 1789. During its return voyage to Europe in 1791, the Pandora ran aground on the outer Great Barrier Reef. It sank the next morning, killing 31 crew members and 4 of the captured mutineers on board. The remaining 89 crew members and 10 prisoners gathered on a small island, then set sail on 4 open boats for Timor Kupang, a European settlement in what is now Indonesia. By the time they arrived, 16 more men had died, and eventually 3 of the mutineers were executed. Colonial authorities in New South Wales, Australia, didn't bother trying to salvage the wreck. It was rediscovered in 1977 by a trio of explorers and is considered to be one of the most significant shipwrecks ever discovered in the Southern Hemisphere. A series of excavations between 1983 and 1999 yielded buttons, fancy shoe buckles, wax seals, and a one-of-a-kind 18th century stamp belonging to the ship's first lieutenant John Larkin. Archaeologists also found 200 human bone fragments belonging to 3 young men who were thought to be between the ages of 17 and 28. They showed signs of poor dental hygiene and chronic diseases, including rickets and syphilis. One of the individuals even bore signs of a disease called spina bifida, along with other skeletal anomalies. Most of the wreck remains buried in sediment and has never been explored. And raising the Pandora from the sea would be extremely costly, so it's unlikely that researchers will conduct further investigation anytime soon. Would you rather stumble across the wreckage of a plane from World War II or a vessel that was once used by pirates? Let us know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.